Omori is one of the most beloved indie games of all time for a lot of reasons, and one of the biggest ones for me at least is the combat. The emotions-based combat system is so fun, the moves and items you get are all so unique, and on top of it all, the bosses are some of the best, most exhilarating experiences to play through in any game I've ever seen. But even among all of these exceptional bosses, there is a hierarchy, so I wanted to go through every boss I fought in Omori and rank them. Also, quick disclaimer, when I say I've fought, I really mean it. I've played through this game a couple of times, but I still haven't been able to do all of the optional bosses, because some of them are found in very specific places and I'm just way too stubborn to look at a guide. If your favorite boss isn't talked about here, tell me about why they're amazing in the comments below. Also, I'm not going to be talking about the different something variants here, because they all have a different purpose to me than the other bosses, and I feel like they would all gravitate to the same-ish area if I did end up rating them anyways, so let's get into it. Also, spoiler warning for some of these bosses, although I feel like that should be pretty self-explanatory by the nature of this video. So I think my least favorite boss in the game to actually fight and defeat was Snaily. This is kind of an obvious pick since his series of boss fights isn't really meant to be taken seriously. Well, I didn't take it seriously at least. But I just felt bad the entire time I was fighting them because they come to you and ask for you to fight them, but then they ask you to stop once they start getting beaten, and after the final fight with them they just die, which I was not expecting and kind of devastated me. I was actually distraught for a while after that fight. Aside from that, I like Snaily as a character, but his music and patterns aren't the most complex, which is what landed them here.
Also, just to let you guys know, any boss that has push and shove as their main theme is at a huge disadvantage since that song is good, but it also gives me a headache, so.
I would say that the next boss on this ranking is the Earth. I never ended up finding the boss rush place, by the way, so I'm only ranking their base version. It's just kind of a planet. I can't say their design was bad because I live there, but it's not exceptional, so I don't think it's great or anything. The music was kind of a bop, but everything else was pretty unremarkable. It's a planet. I actually kind of struggled a bit while fighting them for the first time since I didn't know there would just be a boss out of nowhere, but they don't have any moves that I struggled with or interesting strategies. But I mean, if this is one of the lower end bosses, that's a great sign because this fight was by no means not fun. Alright, and next up, the second of the push and shove boys, it's Boss. It's not confusing at all. I like Boss. His design is great and his fight is good for what it is. The fight is essentially a pre-tutorial, even before they teach you any of the combat systems or emotion triangles or anything, they just push you headlong into this, and I kinda appreciate that. I enjoyed being able to figure things out in a pretty low stakes way since I kinda anticipated that Boss didn't want to really do any harm. But on the scale with some of the other amazing bosses in the game, it wasn't anything notable. I will always remember Boss for being the first boss of the game and for his amazing design, but I don't think anything else was that important here. It feels a bit cheap to put early game bosses lower in this ranking since it's only natural for them to be less complex than their late game counterparts, so I'd chalk this placement down solely to the fact that it's a tutorial boss and not much else. The old Sprout is really cute and I love his Forest Elder design so much. The music is also great for the entirety of the fight and it really gave me a preview into some of the later bosses in the game. This boss also continues the trend of making me feel really bad for the enemies I fight since I really did not want to have to cut down this elderly turnip creature in cold blood, but I did. I'm a monster. I don't think I can honestly list a single problem with this fight, it's just not as interesting as others, which isn't a bad thing, every game has to start from somewhere. This next one may be a bit of a controversial pick. I kinda got tired of the whole Sir Maximus bit after the second one. The first fight was pretty cool, the fact that it's a Sprout mole with a souped up design, I liked them. And after I defeated the first one and Sir Maximus the second rolled up, I laughed harder than I would care to admit. But then the moment I got through the second fight and the third Sir Maximus rolled up, I was kinda tired of the bit. This entire dungeon I was gearing up to fight Sweetheart and I was getting a bit tired of all the running around, so when this roadblock appeared not once, not twice, but 3 times, I just kinda wanted it to be over with. Still fun and a great fight, but a bit dull. Also, in what I think is a controversially low spot, I didn't really like the Humphrey fight. I really enjoyed the fight that came before it and the way the fight started off is really intense. The only issue is that I think it dragged on for a bit too long. The whole thing was pretty difficult, but not in an interesting or thought-provoking way. I just kind of felt like I was doing nothing the entire time as this haughty pink whale kept consuming me time and time again. I like the different forms that Humphrey takes, but after the third or so switch, I kind of realized I wasn't going to lose the fight because of how well my team was built at this point, so it was just a slog to wait till the fight was over. I love a lot of things about it, but I just think it's way too long for what it is. Next up is Kite Kid and his kite. This is another one of those bosses I had no idea was a boss, so when I first stumbled across him, I was completely not ready to fight. Regardless though, it wasn't too challenging to beat him up. Apparently there's a gimmick where the kite will continuously revive if you leave the kid alive, but I kinda lucked into defeating the kid first out of instinct, so I won without much challenge. I really like Kite Kid's design and whole atmosphere. The almost pilot outfit he wears is really neat, and I enjoy the kite's design too. The music is also really, really good. There isn't anything I would say I disliked about this boss fight, but there is nothing that would push it above any of the higher up bosses. Next up is the download window. This is one of those bosses that got a real reaction out of me, and in this case, the reaction was laughter. I freaked out when this actual computer download screen popped up and picked a fight, but I soon stopped laughing because this battle was really hard for some reason. I have no clue why it gave me as much trouble as it did, but I struggled badly. I managed to defeat them after a bit, but I was not expecting that at all. The music for this boss is also extremely stellar. If I had to complain about one thing, it's that the confusion I felt from facing down such a random boss kinda circumvented my desire to beat it. I didn't have much drive to fight this download screen, unlike some of the bosses later on. It was still a really fun time though. In a similar vein of bosses that made me absolutely lose it when playing this game, the life gem guy is still so funny to me. It just pops out of nowhere and completely messes up your entire team just to give you a lesson on how to revive them, which is just so unhinged and so perfect for someone with as much malice in their soul as he has. It's like if the Kool-Aid Man was a serial killer. I love it. Also, this guy weirdly has one of the best music tracks in the game for his fight. It's unironically incredible. I know this isn't the same as the other bosses on the list since the fight is basically a glorified cutscene since you're destined to die, but the joy I had when fighting this guy and the terror of thinking I'd be wiped out by him makes this spot very deserving. Going from one extreme reaction to another, I like things that are meant to scare me, but fear is not something I expected to have when playing this game. But King Crawler just came and took my expectations and slapped me across the face with it. Even within the dark area that King Crawler is found within, there aren't many enemies that were actually unnerving. Even the spider-like creatures that roam around didn't really do much, which made this guy so unexpectedly intense. His design and introduction to the player are top-notch, and the fact that you can see the husks of different sprout moles making up his body is so cool. I love this design to death, and I think it's one of the best enemies in the game. Aside from that, it really isn't that exceptional on any other fronts, but the atmosphere and design take it far. I know that there are two other Sweetheart variants that I've heard good things about, but I've only actually fought the one you can fight on the normal route of the game, Roboheart. Roboheart's design is pretty cool. It's clearly inspired by Sweetheart, but they managed to make it a distinct and unique thing. The fight itself wasn't too challenging, but everything about it was just pretty top-notch across the board. I think one of my favorite parts of the fight is that you can decode the thing she's saying and learn that she's not actually an evil robot, which I found equally as cool as it was sad, but no use crying over spilled milk. Getting to the higher spots on this list, we have Pluto, Expanded. Despite how uncomfortable the word expanded makes me feel when used in reference to a fictional character, this boss slaps. His music is so good. This is one of the tracks that I'll just put on while sitting in my room to make me feel better about life. His sprite is also insanely funny to me, but combined with the music, it's also genuinely menacing. It's hard to strike such a balance of being humorous but still intimidating, but the boss managed to strike it really well. And it's good that the fear I felt was there since this boss is actually really tough to go against. I wasn't prepared for this after the boss fight that came before it, which I also had difficulties with, so I literally almost died on my first run through. Overall, I had no qualms with this guy. They were a lot of fun to fight and a really satisfying time to overcome. Next, we have the Slime Girls. To be honest, their designs aren't even that spectacular considering their premise. Anthropomorphizing sea creatures is old news, but I just like their vibe for some reason. The build-up of seeing them all around Humphrey and then finally getting to face them at the climax of that dungeon, it's just really solid. The boss fight itself wasn't actually too difficult since I had a really solid strategy by this time in the run, and their moves and abilities were not too challenging to take on, which kinda makes sense considering you have to fight against Humphrey right after this, but I think they could have had a bit more of a gimmick, especially with there being 3 of them in all. It could have had some really cool emotion stuff revolving around that, but I can't blame them for not being too ambitious with this. Overall, really solid boss without any real issues to note. For this one, I don't know if I'm ranking the boss fight or if I'm ranking the character, but I love Mr. Jawsome. He just has such a fun aesthetic and his whole mob boss demeanor makes him really fun to take on. The music for this fight is exceptional as well. He has this gimmick where you have to knock out both of his henchmen in order to actually deal damage to him, and I may have not understood that right away, so I felt like I was doing nothing for a bit, because I was, but I eventually figured it out without too much of an issue. I wouldn't really call the fight a hard time after the initial confusion, but a boss doesn't have to be insanely challenging to be fun, you know? The atmosphere and the vibe of this fight combined with how much I like Mr. Jawsome as a character makes me a huge fan of this fight. Alright, so before we get to the top 3, I just want to say I won't be talking about any of the faraway town bosses or the endgame ones. They serve a very different purpose from the other bosses, and I can't rank them in good faith without them getting a massive disadvantage or advantage depending on their circumstances. They're all good though, and they serve their role well. For a game as long as Omori, I went in with the expectation that all of the really good bosses would be saved for the end of the game, and in a lot of cases I was correct. But somehow the first end of dungeon boss of the game is still a cut above the rest. Space Ex-Boyfriend is such a fun fight and concept.
It is the introduction to so many things in this game, the use of 3-stage emotions, the concept of emotions being tied to the inner workings of a boss, and really breaking the player down and forcing them to come up with some interesting strategies to beat them. They have such a prominent place in my head as the capstone of the first dungeon, and everything about them lives up to that expectation. The music and character designs for him, the sadness we feel on his behalf, and the raw intensity of him when he changes emotions on his own during the fight, it's such a great fight and I have no way of critiquing it. A big factor of how much I enjoy a boss is how much I want to beat them. The best experiences I have when fighting enemies in a game is when I have some strong conviction or motivation to overcome them. And I think the boss that does this best in the entire game is Sweetheart. Sweetheart is built up as this awful, terrible person who lords over the Sprout Moles with an iron fist and a pink bow. And through every interaction we have with her in the game, your desire to throw hands only grows. While I think the length of Sweetheart's castle dungeon in the game is a bit too much, it does make the fight at the end all the more climactic, and in that regard the boss fight absolutely does not disappoint. The amazing music, the array of moves she uses, and the unbelievably cocky expression on her face, which just makes you want to win all the more. The fight is so good at just drawing out my desire to win. The fight wasn't too difficult for me since I had seen 3-stage emotions before, but there were some emotion changing attacks that completely messed up my strategy pretty early on in the battle. It was sufficiently difficult and well worth the long build up, a masterclass on how to craft a great boss. If you've played Omori all the way through, you should know what boss deserves this spot. It is the hardest optional boss in the game and the sole reason I decided to play the Hikikomori route. I'm talking of course about Space Ex-Husband. Obviously, if I praised Space Ex-Boyfriend to the extent that I did, this fight is a no-brainer to be at the top of this list. Space Ex-Husband is so cool and is so sad. I think uncontroversially, Space Ex-Husband's fight has the best emotion to gameplay interaction in the game, which is expected since this is essentially the hardest boss in the game and is hidden in a very out-of-the-way area of a very hard-to-reach ending. The boss fight progresses in a very interesting way that basically no other fight in the game does, but that's not the only thing that this fight does that's unique. I think, and I really hope I'm saying this correctly, but I think that this is the only boss in the game with completely unique sprites for each of his emotions. Like, it's not just a facial expression change, it's a complete thing. But even if that's not the case, and I'm completely wrong, which isn't unlikely, the sprite work for this boss is beautiful. I love each of them so dearly, and I wish that they weren't so sad. I think even past the gameplay of this fight, which is exceptional, I just love the theming so much. The way this broken person spirals between all of the emotions of a breakup, and you just want nothing else but to help him, from his catatonic state to his extreme anger to his deep sadness or his wistful joy, it all just hits pretty close to home in a lot of ways. All in all, I'd say that this is an amazing last moment to give a great character, and I'm happy they chose to give this fight so much attention. Well, that was all of them, or at least all of them that I played. Looking at the list of all the bosses in the game, I realized that I missed a lot more than I expected, and I'd like to apologize once again for that. My playthroughs of this game were very uniquely mine, which is a fancy way of saying I missed a lot of stuff. If you have any opinions on my rankings or have another boss you feel passionately about, please let me know in the comments below. Anyways, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!